My parents gave everything to my older brother and treated me like I was invisible. When I finally succeeded, they came back begging. I'm Ben. I'm 36 years old now, and for most of my life, I thought there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Not in the loud, dramatic way people talk about trauma online, but in the quiet way that settles into your bones when you grow up feeling optional. Like an extra chair in a room that's already full, and it took me years, decades really, to understand that what I felt wasn't a personal failure. It was the result of being the son my parents forgot, because in our house, love wasn't free. It was conditional, and the conditions were never written for me. They were written for my older brother Mick, who's 4 years older than me and has always been the center of gravity in our family, the one everything bent around, the one whose needs were always louder, more urgent, more worthy of attention. While I existed in the background, like static noise everyone learned to tune out, and when I look back now, what hurts the most isn't one big traumatic event, but 1,000 small moments that taught me over and over again that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be chosen first or even second, sometimes not at all. Growing up, Mick was what people like to call a handful, which is a polite way of saying he caused problems everywhere he went. But in our family, that word came with a strange affection, like his chaos was proof of his importance. If Mick struggled in school, it was because the teachers didn't understand him. If he got into fights, it was because other kids provoked him. If he broke rules, it was because he was passionate and misunderstood. And my parents wrapped those excuses around him like a blanket, tucking him in with reassurance that the world was wrong and he was right. While I learned early on that being easy, quiet, and self-sufficient didn't earn praise, it earned invisibility. I did well in school, not because anyone pushed me, but because books were safer than people. And I remember bringing home report cards with straight A's, setting them on the kitchen counter, waiting for some kind of reaction, only to hear something like, "That's good, Ben," said without looking up, because Mick had just been suspended again, and that was the real crisis, the real story, the thing that needed fixing. And after a while, I stopped showing them my grades altogether, because it felt embarrassing to ask for recognition that was never coming. My parents compared us constantly, but never in a way that favored me. It was always, "Why can't you be more outgoing like Mick?" Or, "Mick has leadership qualities, you're too quiet." Or my personal favorite, "Mick just needs more support, you're stronger." Which sounds like a compliment until you realize it's just an excuse to give someone else everything while you're expected to survive on nothing. And that phrase, "you're stronger," followed me like a shadow, because it meant I didn't get help when I struggled. I got expectations, I got silence, I got the assumption that I'd just figure it out on my own. One of the earliest memories that really sticks with me happened when I was about 9 and Mick was 13, and he'd forgotten to do a big school project that counted for a huge portion of his grade. So the night before it was due, the house was in chaos. My mom pacing, my dad on the phone trying to negotiate with the teacher, Mick yelling about how unfair it all was, and I was sitting at the kitchen table finishing my homework, quiet as always, when my dad snapped at me to stop tapping my pencil because it was distracting Mick, and I remember freezing, holding my breath, shrinking into myself, because even the sound I made just existing was considered an inconvenience when it interfered with Mick's needs. As we got older, the gap between us didn't shrink, it widened, because Mick's mistakes got bigger and my parents' support got louder, more visible, more expensive, while my successes stayed small and private, like things that only mattered if I was alone to witness them. When Mick needed money, they found it. When he needed second chances, they fought for them. When he needed rescuing, they showed up without hesitation. But when I needed anything, guidance, encouragement, even just someone to say, "I'm proud of you," I learned not to ask because asking made me feel weak, and being weak meant I was a problem, and problems were only acceptable when they belonged to Mick. The defining moment, the one that still plays in my head with painful clarity, happened when I was 15, old enough to understand what I was hearing, but young enough for it to change the trajectory of my life. And it wasn't during a fight or a dramatic confrontation, it was an accident. One of those moments you're never meant to witness, but that reshapes you anyway. Mick had just gotten into serious trouble, again, and my parents thought I was upstairs in my room, but I was actually standing at the top of the stairs, frozen, listening to their voices float up from the living room. My mom sounding exhausted, my dad sounding resigned, and then my mom said, "I don't know how much more we can do." And my dad replied, "We don't have a choice, Mick needs us more." And there was a pause, just long enough for me to lean closer, and then he added the sentence that would quietly break something inside me. "Ben will figure it out on his own." There was no malice in his voice, no anger, just certainty. Like, this was an obvious truth everyone agreed on, and in that moment I realized something that no child should have to realize, that my role in the family was not to be loved, protected, or prioritized, but to be convenient, to be the one who didn't need anything so that everything could be given to someone else. And I stood there in the dark hallway, my heart pounding, feeling like I'd just been erased from my own life, like I'd been demoted from son to background character without anyone bothering to tell me. After that, something shifted in me. Not in a dramatic way where I rebelled or acted out, but in a slow, internal way, where I stopped expecting fairness and started planning for independence. Because if I was always going to be on my own, then I needed to learn how to survive without leaning on anyone. And that mindset followed me through the rest of my childhood, through high school, through every family dinner where Mick's latest crisis dominated the conversation, while my milestones passed unmentioned, through birthdays that felt more like obligations than celebrations, through holidays where I watched my parents pour their energy into fixing Mick, while I quietly helped clean up afterward. Invisible, but useful. I don't think my parents ever saw themselves as cruel people, and that's part of what made it so confusing, because they weren't monsters. They didn't scream at me or hit me or throw me out. They just didn't see me, and neglect wrapped in good intentions still teaches the same lesson. You don't matter as much, and over time I internalized that belief so deeply that it shaped how I moved through the world, how I minimized my needs, how I avoided asking for help, how I learned to be proud of myself in silence because sharing my achievements felt pointless, almost embarrassing, like bragging to an empty room. By the time I left home, I wasn't angry, not outwardly at least. I was numb, emotionally independent to a fault, convinced that closeness was unreliable and that love was something you earned by being useful or invisible. And I didn't know then that this emotional blueprint would follow me into adulthood, influencing my choices, my relationships, my career, all because of that one sentence spoken casually in a living room years ago. The sentence that explained everything I'd felt but couldn't articulate. Mick needs us more. Ben will figure it out on his own. I figured it out, all right, but not in the way they probably imagined, because figuring it out meant learning to live without them, learning to build my identity away from their approval, learning to accept that I was emotionally alone even in a crowded house. And as I stand here now, telling the story at 36, I can still feel the echo of that moment. The quiet understanding settling into a teenage boy's chest, the understanding that would become both my greatest wound and, eventually, the foundation for everything I built later in life. By the time I finished high school and started thinking about college, the pattern was so ingrained that I didn't even question it anymore. I just assumed that whatever support existed in my family wasn't meant for me. It was reserved for Mick, and that assumption proved correct in ways that were so consistent they almost felt scripted. Mick decided to go to a private college he couldn't afford, a decision that was treated like a brave leap of faith rather than a reckless gamble. And my parents sat him down at the kitchen table and talked through tuition, housing, meal plans, books, and then quietly co-signed his student loans without hesitation, my mom even saying, "We'll figure it out together," as if his future was a shared family project, while I, sitting a few feet away, already knew better than to ask what together meant for me. When it came time for my turn, I applied to a state school, picked one within commuting distance to save money, and filled out financial aid forms alone in my bedroom late at night, Googling terms I didn't understand. And when I finally asked my parents if they could help me cover textbooks for the first semester, a few $100s, nothing more. They exchanged looks, the kind that silently say no before words ever do. And my dad told me, "We can't right now. Mick's situation is tight," as if Mick's situation was a permanent natural disaster that required constant emergency funding. And I nodded, said, "That's okay," and went back to my room feeling that familiar mix of shame and resignation, because even asking had felt like overstepping. I worked multiple jobs through college. Early morning shifts, late nights, weekends, balancing classes with exhaustion, learning how to survive on caffeine and determination, and I didn't tell my parents how hard it was because struggle only counted when it belonged to Mick. Meanwhile, Mick bounced between majors, skipped classes, partied too much, failed courses, and every time something went wrong, my parents stepped in like a safety net that never tore, never frayed, never said no, paying late fees, negotiating extensions, sending money when he overdrafted, always framing it as temporary help even though it never ended. I remember one semester when Mick failed out entirely, a dramatic collapse that sent him spiraling back home, and the house went into crisis mode, my mom crying, my dad making calls, relatives offering sympathy, while I quietly passed all my classes that same semester, earned a scholarship renewal through sheer effort, and didn't tell anyone because it felt inappropriate to bring good news into a room that only had space for Mick's failure. At family gatherings during those years, the dynamic became almost absurd in its predictability. Mick's latest problem would dominate the conversation, whether it was school, money, relationships, or some vague sense that life was unfair to him, and everyone would nod, offer advice, express concern, while I sat there answering questions only when directly asked, usually about why I worked so much, or why I seemed tired, or why I wasn't having more fun like Mick, as if fun was something you chose when survival wasn't optional. If I ever mentioned an accomplishment, landing a better job, getting a good grade, saving enough to move closer to campus, it was acknowledged briefly and then forgotten, swallowed whole by the gravity of Mick's needs, and over time, I learned to stop sharing altogether, because there was something uniquely lonely about speaking into a void while watching someone else be celebrated for simply existing. The resentment didn't explode all at once. It built slowly, quietly, like pressure behind a wall, because I wasn't angry that Mick needed help. I was angry that I apparently didn't deserve any, that my independence was treated as proof that I didn't matter, that the very traits I developed to survive, reliability, discipline, emotional control, were used as justification to keep giving me less. And the more capable I became, the more invisible I grew. There was one moment during my junior year that crystallized this feeling in a way I still can't forget. Mick had decided to try college again, a new school, a fresh start, and my parents were once again co-signing loans, paying deposits, rearranging finances, and during one of those discussions, my mom casually mentioned that they might need to tighten their budget for a while. And I joked, half serious, half hopeful, that maybe we could all be broke together, and she smiled sympathetically and said, "You'll be fine, Ben. You always land on your feet." And something about the certainty in her voice, the complete lack of concern, made me realize that my parents didn't see my struggle because they didn't have to, because my struggle didn't disrupt their world the way Mick's did, and that realization hurt more than any outright rejection ever could. I watched Mick fail repeatedly and be rescued every time. Watched him complain about pressure while being shielded from consequences. Watched my parents rewrite history to protect him, while I quietly succeeded in ways that required no applause because I'd stopped expecting any. And somewhere in the middle of all that, during a long drive back from work one night, exhausted and running on fumes, it hit me with startling clarity. I wasn't competing with Mick. I never had been, because the competition implied that we were being judged by the same standards, and we weren't. Mick was competing for attention, sympathy, and endless second chances, and I was competing against something far more insidious, the possibility of being forgotten entirely. Once I understood that, a strange calm settled over me, because it explained everything, from the way my parents spoke to me, to the way they didn't, from the way my achievements vanished into thin air to the way my failures were treated as personal inconveniences rather than family emergencies. And that understanding changed how I moved through the rest of my college years, because I stopped trying to matter to people who had already decided I didn't need to. I kept my head down, worked harder, graduated without debt, and didn't attend the small family dinner my parents hosted afterward because Mick was going through another rough patch and it didn't feel like the right time. And even though that should have broken me, it didn't, because by then I had accepted the truth that had been quietly shaping my life for years. In my family, being low maintenance meant being low priority, and if I wanted a future where I wasn't invisible, I was going to have to build it somewhere else, without applause, without reassurance, and without waiting for anyone to finally choose me. The breaking point didn't come with shouting or slammed doors or some dramatic declaration where I finally stood up for myself, because that would have required me to still believe my voice mattered in that house, and by then I didn't. It came quietly, wrapped in humiliation, during a family incident that felt so unfair and so revealing that it drained whatever hope I had left of ever being truly seen by my parents. And the worst part was that it wasn't even about me. It was about Mick, like always, and somehow I still ended up paying the price for his mess. I was in my mid-20s by then, freshly graduated, working full-time, exhausted but proud of myself in that small private way I learned to live with, and Mick was back home again after another failed attempt at getting his life together. Drifting between jobs, racking up debt, borrowing money he never repaid, and leaning on my parents as if it were his birthright. One evening, my parents hosted a small family gathering, nothing fancy, just relatives and a few family friends. And Mick had been asked repeatedly to handle one simple responsibility: pick up catering on the way home, something my parents insisted he could manage, a chance for him to step up. And unsurprisingly, he didn't. He forgot or overslept or just didn't feel like it. And by the time everyone arrived, there was no food, no explanation, just awkward silence and rising tension. I offered to run out and grab something quickly, not because it was my fault, but because that reflex to fix things, to smooth over problems I didn't create, was deeply ingrained in me. But before I could even grab my keys, my dad snapped and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is what happens when people don't take responsibility." And then, without looking at Mick, he turned to me and said, "Ben, you said you'd help today, didn't you?" And I remember standing there, stunned, because I hadn't said that, not once, not ever. And in that moment, Mick didn't correct him. My mom didn't step in, no one spoke up, and the narrative shifted seamlessly, effortlessly, as if it had been rehearsed, until suddenly I was the unreliable one. The disappointment, the reason the evening was awkward. And when I tried to calmly explain, quietly, respectfully, that Mick was the one responsible, my mom cut me off with a sharp, "This isn't the time," followed by something that burned far deeper than anger. "Why are you always making things harder?" The room went silent, every eye on me, and I felt that familiar heat of embarrassment crawl up my neck, the same feeling I'd had as a kid when my needs were framed as inconveniences. And in that moment, I realized with brutal clarity that it didn't matter what the truth was. It only mattered who was easier to blame, and that would always be me, because blaming Mick would mean acknowledging his pattern, and blaming me cost them nothing. They sided with him publicly, decisively, rewriting the story in real time. My dad telling everyone, "Ben misunderstood." My mom asking me to apologize for the tension, and Mick sitting there, arms crossed, looking almost relieved, like he'd just been handed another free pass, and something inside me finally went still. Not angry, not explosive, just done. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm out. I apologized because that was expected of me. And then I went outside, sat in my car for a long time, and stared at the steering wheel while the last emotional thread connecting me to that family quietly snapped. That was the night I stopped trying, not in a dramatic way, but in a deeply personal one. I stopped explaining myself, stopped hoping that if I just found the right words or the right moment, they'd finally understand. Because understanding would require them to see me, and seeing me would force them to confront the imbalance they'd built their entire parenting identity around. After that, my withdrawal was subtle enough that they didn't notice at first. I answered calls less frequently, kept conversation surface level, shared nothing personal, and when an opportunity came up for a job in another city, I took it without hesitation, packing my life into boxes with a strange sense of relief, like I was finally allowed to leave a room I'd been holding my breath in for years. I moved away quietly, didn't ask for help, didn't seek approval, just informed them of my decision like it was a fact rather than a request, and their reaction was predictably muted, a mix of mild surprise and vague encouragement, because my life changes never triggered alarms the way Mick's did, and that realization no longer hurt the way it once had. It felt validating, like proof that I was doing the right thing by stepping away. In that new city alone for the first time in a way that felt intentional rather than imposed, I began building something that belonged only to me. Not out of spite or revenge, but out of necessity. Because if no one else was going to invest in me, I was going to have to become my own safety net. I poured myself into my work, learned new skills, took risks I never would have taken if I were still trying to stay palatable to my family. And for the first time in my life, my effort was directly connected to my outcome. No favoritism, no shifting narratives, no one rewriting my story to suit someone else's comfort. I didn't announce my progress, didn't update my parents on promotion or side projects or the small wins that slowly added up to something substantial, because I wasn't doing it to be seen anymore. And that was the key shift, the quiet transformation that changed everything. I stopped trying to matter to people who had already decided I was optional, and I started building a life that didn't require their approval to feel real. The silence between us grew, not from conflict, but from neglect. The same neglect I'd always lived with, only now it worked in my favor, giving me space to grow without being pulled back into old roles. And while my parents continued revolving their lives around Mick's ongoing chaos, I was laying foundations in solitude, learning who I was when I wasn't constantly shrinking myself to fit into someone else's narrative. Looking back, that humiliating family incident wasn't just a breaking point. It was the moment the fog lifted, the moment I understood that waiting for fairness in that family was a losing game, and that the only way forward was to step out of it entirely. Not with bitterness, not with anger, but with a calm, deliberate decision to stop being the forgotten son and start being the man who chose himself, even if no one else ever did. The years after I moved away blurred together in the way they only do when no one is watching, when there's no audience to perform for and no expectations to live up to except your own. And if I'm being honest, those years were not glamorous or easy or secretly amazing the way people like to imagine when they hear he disappeared and succeeded. Because the truth is, I struggled a lot, failed more times than I can count, and spent long stretches wondering if I'd made a mistake by cutting myself off emotionally from the only family I'd ever known. But the difference this time was that every failure belonged to me. Every lesson was earned honestly, and every small step forward felt real in a way nothing ever had before. I started in a cramped apartment with thin walls and secondhand furniture, working a job that paid just enough to cover rent and groceries, learning quickly that independence didn't magically make life easier. It just made it quieter. And in that quiet, I had to confront parts of myself I'd been too busy suppressing before. The exhaustion of always being self-reliant, the fear that maybe my parents were right and I really was on my own because I didn't deserve more, the temptation to call home when things got hard even though I knew exactly how that would end. There were nights I sat on the floor eating cheap takeout, staring at spreadsheets, trying to make sense of my finances, teaching myself skills after work because I couldn't afford classes, failing interviews, losing opportunities, starting side projects that went nowhere, and then starting again anyway, not because I was particularly brave, but because quitting would have meant going back to a life where I was invisible, and I couldn't do that anymore. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, at first things began to change. Not in big dramatic leaps, but in small, steady increments that added up over time. I got better at my work, then I got noticed for it, then I got trusted with more responsibility, and instead of sabotaging myself the way I might have before, I leaned into it because there was no one waiting to pull me back into an old role. No one reminding me to stay small for the sake of family harmony. I failed, adjusted, learned, and rebuilt over and over again. And somewhere in that cycle, I realized something important. Success felt different when it wasn't being measured against someone else's approval, when it wasn't a desperate attempt to finally be chosen, but simply the natural result of consistent effort over time. I didn't tell my parents about promotions or raises or side income streams, partly because it never occurred to me to share, and partly because I'd learned that information flowed one way in my family, toward Mick, and anything I revealed would eventually be filtered through that lens, either dismissed or repurposed to serve someone else's needs. So I kept my life private, not secretive, just unadvertised. And in an age where everyone documents their milestones online, I did the opposite. I never posted about work, never shared photos of new purchases, never hinted at progress because my power was invisible by design, and there was something deeply satisfying about that invisibility. Something that felt like control for the first time in my life. Over the years, stability replaced survival. My bank account stopped feeling like a ticking clock. My anxiety softened into something manageable, and one day I realized I could afford a down payment on a modest home. A quiet place that belonged entirely to me. No roommates, no borrowed furniture, no emotional baggage tucked into corners. And when I signed those papers, alone in an office with a stranger congratulating me, I felt a swell of pride that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong and everything to do with proving myself right. I built routines, invested carefully, learned how to plan for the future instead of just reacting to emergencies, and I formed relationships that were steady and mutual, friendships where I didn't have to earn my place by being useful, where showing up as myself was enough, and that emotional stability, more than the financial success, felt like the real victory, because for the first time I wasn't constantly bracing for disappointment. Through all of this, my parents remained largely unaware of the details of my life, operating under the assumption that I was doing okay, which in their language meant surviving but not thriving. And I didn't correct them, because correcting them would have required an interest they'd never shown before, and because there was a strange freedom in letting them underestimate me the same way they always had. When we spoke, which wasn't often, the conversations were surface level, polite, centered mostly around Mick, who, as expected, was beginning to unravel under the weight of years of unchecked support and zero accountability. His financial problems grew more severe, his relationships more volatile, his confidence brittle in a way that came from being propped up for too long. And every story my parents told me about him followed the same pattern of concern mixed with justification, as if reality was something happening to him rather than something he was actively creating. I listened, offered neutral responses, never advice, because I'd learned that advice was unwelcome unless it reinforced the narrative they were already committed to. And as Mick spiraled, my parents leaned in harder, pouring time, money, and energy into saving him yet again, completely unaware that the quiet son they assumed was just getting by had built a life that no longer required their involvement. I didn't feel smug about it, didn't feel triumphant, because this wasn't a competition I'd won. It was a distance I'd created, a boundary that protected me from being pulled back into old patterns. And even when things went well for me, I treated them with the same quiet restraint I'd learned years ago, not out of fear, but out of clarity. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from knowing you don't owe anyone a performance, from understanding that your worth isn't dependent on being seen. And during those years of silent growth, I finally experienced that peace, living a life that made sense to me, not one designed to elicit approval from people who'd never learned how to give it. By the time I turned 36, I was financially secure, emotionally grounded, and surrounded by people who knew me as I was, not as a supporting character in someone else's story. And if my parents had looked closely, they might have noticed the difference, but they didn't, because they were still watching Mick, still reacting to his crises, still assuming that I would, as always, figure it out on my own. What they didn't realize was that I had figured it out completely, quietly, and in a way that no longer included them at the center. And the irony was that the very neglect that once made me feel small had given me the space to grow into someone they would one day look at with surprise, confusion, and eventually need, though at the time, I had no idea just how dramatically that reversal was going to unfold. It started so subtly that if I hadn't lived my entire life being overlooked, I might have missed it, but when my parents suddenly began calling again after years of polite distance, I felt that old instinctive tightening in my chest, the quiet alarm that had learned to recognize pattern shifts long before my mind could articulate them. The tone was different this time, warmer, softer, almost careful, like they were approaching a skittish animal, and at first the conversations were harmless enough. How was I doing? How was work? Had I been busy? Small talk layered with a strange, almost awkward enthusiasm that felt out of place after so much disinterest, and I answered politely, cautiously, giving them nothing substantial, because a part of me already sensed that this attention wasn't about reconciliation, it was about discovery. I found out later that the discovery hadn't come from me at all, but from someone else, a distant relative, a mutual acquaintance, someone who'd casually mentioned my name in a conversation, commented on my work, my home, my stability, my success in a way that made my parents stop and reevaluate the mental image they'd been carrying of me for years. And once that image cracked, everything changed. Suddenly, my mother wanted to know details. My father asked questions about my career, questions he'd never asked before, not even out of obligation, and the interest wasn't subtle, it was probing, like they were trying to map out the extent of something they hadn't realized existed. Then came the invitations, the "we should all get together sometime," the nostalgic references to my childhood framed through a soft, selective lens, stories rewritten to suggest warmth and closeness that had never really been there. And listening to them talk, I felt like I was watching someone try to retrofit affection onto a past that didn't support it, as if saying it confidently enough could make it true. Not long after that, Mick entered the conversation again, though he'd never really left it. Only now his name came wrapped in concern instead of casual updates, his situation described as complicated, unfair, overwhelming, a series of misfortunes rather than the predictable outcome of years of being shielded from consequences. And piece by piece, the real reason for my parents' sudden reappearance emerged. Mick was in trouble, deeper trouble than usual, financially unstable, professionally stuck, burning bridges faster than they could rebuild them, and this time, their resources were stretched thin, their solutions exhausted, and their safety net fraying. That was when the language shifted from interest to expectation, from curiosity to implication. My parents starting to talk about family responsibility, about how we all have to support each other, about how this is what family does. Phrases that landed heavily because I'd spent my entire life watching those principles apply selectively, always flowing in one direction, never toward me. They asked about my connections, my ability to help Mick get back on his feet, my willingness to assist financially, just for a little while. And as they spoke, I felt something inside me settle into clarity, not anger, not bitterness, but understanding. Because for the first time, the pattern was undeniable. They hadn't come back because they missed me, because they regretted the distance, because they wanted to know who I'd become. They came back because they needed me, because I was suddenly useful in a way Mick no longer was. The emotional manipulation crept in gently, disguised as concern and nostalgia, my mother talking about how hard those years had been on all of us. My father mentioning sacrifices they'd made, sacrifices I'd apparently benefited from retroactively, history being rewritten in real time to create a moral debt I was expected to repay, and listening to them, I felt like I was standing outside my own life, watching someone else's version of it being constructed without my consent. They spoke as if my success were a family achievement rather than a solitary one, as if the years I spent working multiple jobs, teaching myself skills, failing and rebuilding in silence, had somehow been supported by them all along. And that reframing was perhaps the most jarring part, because it attempted to claim ownership over a version of me they'd never bothered to invest in. Mick, for his part, oscillated between entitlement and resentment, sometimes reaching out directly with a tone that suggested familiarity he hadn't earned. other times letting my parents speak for him, positioning his need as urgent and my ability as obvious. And in those moments, I could see the same dynamic playing out that had defined our childhoods. His crisis elevated to an emergency, my boundaries treated as obstacles, my refusal framed as selfishness. I listened calmly, carefully, absorbing every word. And what surprised me most was not how angry I felt, but how little I felt at all, because the emotional hooks that might have once pulled me back in had nothing left to latch onto. I wasn't seeking their approval anymore, wasn't hoping for an apology, wasn't waiting for acknowledgement of the imbalance that had shaped our lives, and without that longing, their guilt tactics fell flat. Their rewritten memories rang hollow. The key moment came not during a heated argument, but in a quiet pause, when my mother said something about how proud they were of me, how they'd always known I'd do well, and in that moment I understood fully that this wasn't pride, it was positioning, an attempt to align themselves with my success now that it served a purpose, and that realization settled in my chest with a strange mix of sadness and relief, sadness for the family I'd never really had, and a relief that I no longer needed to chase it. I didn't confront them with a list of past wrongs, didn't throw their neglect back in their faces because doing so would have required me to believe they were capable of truly hearing it, and I knew better by then. Instead, I responded with the same calm detachment I'd cultivated over years of quiet growth, acknowledging their concern, expressing empathy, but stopping short of offering what they actually wanted, and the shift was immediate. The warmth cooling, the disappointment surfacing, the unspoken question hanging in the air. If not now, when? If not you, who? And in that silence, the truth became undeniable to all of us, even if no one said it out loud. My value to them had finally been recognized, not because of who I was, but because of what I could provide. And once I saw that clearly, there was no unseeing it. No pretending this was about reconnection rather than need, no mistaking their sudden interest for love, because love doesn't arrive only when it's convenient. And as I ended those conversations, hanging up the phone or walking away from the table with a polite nod, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. The certainty that the hardest part wasn't saying no, it was accepting that they had never come back for me at all. I didn't plan some grand confrontation or rehearse a speech in the mirror about everything they'd ever done wrong, because by the time we finally sat down together, really sat down, not circling each other through phone calls and half-truths, I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in ending a pattern. And that difference changed everything. We met in a neutral place, not the old house filled with ghosts, not my home either, just a quiet restaurant where no one had the home field advantage. And from the moment they arrived, I could see the confusion on my parents' faces, the subtle discomfort, because the version of me sitting across from them didn't fit the role they'd assigned years ago. I wasn't tentative, I wasn't deferential, I wasn't trying to earn space at the table. I was calm in a way that comes from no longer needing permission. They started the conversation the way they always did now, with concern, with soft voices and careful words. My mom talking about how worried she wasn't about Mick, my dad framing the situation as urgent but temporary, solvable if everyone just pulled together, and I listened without interrupting, without correcting, letting them say everything they'd come to say, because I wanted them to hear themselves, to feel the weight of what they were asking without me having to spell it out. When they finally paused, expecting reassurance or agreement or at least negotiation, I told them the truth, simply and without accusation, that I loved them, that I understood their fear, that I wasn't angry, but that I wasn't going to save Mick, financially or otherwise, because doing so would mean sacrificing the life I'd built, the stability I'd fought for, and myself in the process. And as the words settled between us, I saw something flicker across their faces, shock, disbelief, maybe even a trace of fear, because they weren't used to this version of me. The one who could say no without explaining himself into exhaustion. My mom tried to redirect, talking about family, about how things had been hard for everyone, about how I'd always been strong, and I stopped her gently, not raising my voice, not hardening my tone, just saying that being strong didn't mean being endlessly available, that independence wasn't a resource they could tap into when theirs ran dry, and that for most of my life I'd been asked to understand, to adjust, to endure, while my needs were postponed indefinitely. And I wasn't willing to keep doing that. My dad looked genuinely lost, like someone realizing too late that the rules of the game had changed, and he asked me when I'd become so distant, so cold, and I told him I hadn't become cold. I'd become clear, and that clarity had come from years of being overlooked, of learning that love offered only when it's convenient isn't love at all. It's leverage. Mick, who had been silent until then, finally exploded, his voice rising, his words sharp and familiar, accusing me of thinking I was better than everyone else, of forgetting where I came from, of abandoning him when he needed me most. And as he spoke, I felt a strange sadness rather than anger, because I could see him clearly now too. Not as my rival or my burden, but as someone who had never learned how to stand on his own because he'd never been allowed to fall. I didn't argue with him, didn't defend myself, didn't list the ways I'd been sidelined for his sake, because that conversation would have gone nowhere. And instead, I told him that I hoped he figured things out genuinely, but that it wouldn't be through me. And that boundary landed like an insult because it wasn't wrapped in apology or guilt. My parents tried one last time to soften it, to suggest compromise, to offer emotional concessions in exchange for practical help, but by then it was clear that what they were asking for wasn't support. It was rescue, and rescue had been my role for too long without ever being acknowledged. So I stood up, calmly, paid my share of the bill, and told them that I wasn't cutting them off, I wasn't punishing anyone, I was just choosing not to sacrifice myself anymore, and that if they wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be one that didn't revolve around what I could provide. Walking out of that restaurant, I didn't feel victorious or vindicated. I felt light, like I'd finally set down something heavy I'd been carrying since childhood, and in the days and weeks that followed, the silence returned. But it was different this time. Not imposed, not painful, but chosen. A space I could breathe in. I thought there might be regret, that I'd second guess myself late at night, replay the conversation, and wonder if I'd been too harsh. But what I felt instead was peace. The quiet assurance that I had done the one thing I'd never been allowed to do before. Choose myself without apology. My parents didn't suddenly understand, Mick didn't magically change, and there was no cinematic resolution where everyone hugged and acknowledged their mistakes, but there didn't need to be, because the point wasn't to fix them, it was to stop breaking myself. And as I returned to my life, to my routine, to the home I built, and the relationships that were grounded in mutual respect, I realized that this was what winning actually looked like. Not revenge, not recognition, not watching them suffer, but walking forward without carrying their expectations on my back. Finally, free to live a life that didn't require me to disappear so someone else could shine. The end.